Welcome to Kids Beyond the Pitch, the Kids for the World podcast exploring the impact of football kits on sustainability, social change, and the broader sports industry's environmental responsibility.
Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. This time we're going to be looking at the circular economy and how it's impacting textiles and the sporting world.
Two industries you might not immediately think of as being connected.
Yeah, that's right. But when you think about it, both rely so much on materials and resources.
And there's this growing pressure to move away from that old linear model of make waste right.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And that's where this stack of sources comes in handy, I think.
Yeah.
You give us a pretty diverse perspective on the whole thing.
Oh yeah, we've got market research from IMARC.
We've got some EU policy documents.
And even your personal notes on what's happening in the sportswear world.
Which I'm very excited to dig into. And then also we've got summaries of the EU Waste Framework Directive.
UEFA's Circular Economy Guidelines.
And even some research on those microplastics that come off our clothes.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's a really great mix that lets us see this issue from different sides, you know?
Yeah. Like, what are the companies dealing with? What are we as consumers thinking about? And then how are governments trying to kind of steer things in a more sustainable direction?
Exactly.
So I think a good place to start would be with your notes on sportswear. You mentioned how competitive that market is.
Yeah.
Like you've got Adidas, Nike, Puma, all these huge brands constantly battling it out.
Yeah. It's a tough landscape for sure. You know, on top of that, you've got fluctuating raw material prices and all these regulations they have to adhere to. It's a lot to manage.
It sounds like a pretty intense game to play.
It is. And that's where a group like IMARC's comes in.
Oh, yeah. What do they do?
Well, they seem to be all about helping businesses navigate these complex challenges.
Yeah, their website's got all this stuff about market research and consulting and helping businesses break into new markets.
And they have some pretty impressive client testimonials, too.
Yeah, that's what I was looking at. Like all these companies praising their professionalism and their speed and how they can customize their solutions. It seems like they've figured out the secret sauce for success in this rapidly changing world.
What's interesting is how they present themselves as problem solvers. You know, they seem to really get that businesses need more than just data. They need actionable strategies to actually thrive in this kind of environment.
So we've got these businesses trying to adapt, but what's the bigger picture here? What's the ideal scenario?
Right. Well, that's where the EU's vision for circular textiles comes in.
Okay.
They've laid out this pretty bold strategy. Their idea is to create a system where producers are responsible for their products for the entire life cycle, even when they become waste.
So it's about like closing the loop, right?
Exactly. It's a huge shift in thinking. Moving towards this circular textiles ecosystem where recycling, especially fiber-to-fiber recycling, is the norm.
So instead of clothes ending up in landfills or being incinerated, the goal is to keep those materials in circulation, turning old clothes into new ones.
Exactly. It's a complete departure from that linear take-make-waste model we've been stuck with for so long.
Right. And to really drive home how important this shift is, we can look at this pretty shocking statistic from the UEFA Circular Economy Guidelines. They say that 73% of textiles globally are either landfilled or incinerated. 73%. Wow. That's a massive amount of waste.
It is. To give you some perspective, the EU alone throws away something like 5.8 million tons of textiles every year.
So that's like each person chucking out 11 kilograms of clothes every year.
Yeah, pretty much. It's pretty mind-boggling.
So what is driving this massive pileup of clothes in the first place?
Well, the UEFA guidelines point to fast fashion as a major culprit, you know? It's all about producing trendy clothes super quickly, encouraging us to buy more and more, but wear those items for much shorter periods. It's kind of like a wear it once and toss it mentality.
Yeah, and that's definitely fueling this waste crisis.
For sure.
And it's not just about how many clothes we're throwing away, right? There's also that research on microplastics, which I got to say is a little bit scary. It's like every time we do laundry, we're adding to this pollution problem.
Yeah, that research really highlights how those synthetic fabrics like polyester, acrylic, nylon, they all shed these tiny little microfibers every time they're washed.
So they just end up in the water.
Pretty much. They end up in our waterways and then eventually they make their way into the ecosystems, you know, the ones we depend on.
So even those like comfy fleece jackets are part of the problem.
Unfortunately, yeah, polyester fleece is actually one of the worst offenders. It sheds a ton of fibers every time you wash it. It's kind of a hidden consequence of our clothing choices.
It really makes you think about what you buy.
It does.
But the good news is that the EU is trying to address this. They're really pushing for innovation, like coming up with new more sustainable types of textiles.
Absolutely. The EU strategy emphasizes moving away from those fibers that are based on fossil fuels and exploring bio-based alternatives instead.
So it's about rethinking the whole process of how we make clothes.
Yeah, the whole materials pipeline.
And they're also focusing on boosting recycling too, right? Especially that fiber-to-fiber recycling we talked about.
Right. It's all about closing the loop on textile production.
And then to make sure those goals actually happen, there's the EU Waste Framework Directive.
Yeah, that's where the law comes in. It introduces those concepts of polluter pays and extended producer responsibility.
So basically, companies are being held accountable for the entire life of their products, from creation to disposal.
Exactly. It's a huge shift in responsibility.
It is. And this directive also sets up this hierarchy for how we should be dealing with waste, right? Like prevention is at the top.
Right. Prevention, then reuse, and then recycling are the top priorities. It's a framework for moving away from just chucking stuff out and embracing that more circular approach.
Okay, so we've got this big picture from the EU, but how does this all actually play out in the real world? Like, let's bring it back to sports. UEFA has those circular economy guidelines, and they're taking this pretty comprehensive approach.
They really are. What impressed me is how they cover so many different areas, not just clothing, but things like energy use and waste management in stadiums.
Oh yeah, like making the whole sporting event more sustainable.
Exactly. And they offer these really concrete steps for clubs to actually implement, which is great.
I was reading that section on apparel waste, and they have some really interesting ideas, like what Macron is doing with their shirts.
Oh, yeah. Macron has this cool approach where they create just one high-performance shirt design that works for both the professional players and the fans.
So they don't have to make separate shirts for everyone.
Exactly. It cuts down on waste, and it lets the clubs sell that extra team apparel as merchandise.
So it's a win-win for the club and the environment.
Exactly. And then there's this idea of working with sponsors to make shirts that are more durable and repairable, you know? Shifting the design process to think about longevity from the start.
So it's about moving away from trends and making pieces that are meant to last.
Right. And getting the fans involved is a big part of it, too. The guidelines talk about encouraging fans to reuse, donate, or resell their shirts.
That's a great idea. And speaking of actually putting these ideas into practice, UEFA has that pilot project where they're working with clubs and stadiums to implement all these circular economy principles.
Yeah, those examples are really inspiring. Like AC Milan and Inter Milan, they're switching from buffets to table service to reduce food waste.
That seems like a pretty simple change.
It is, but it makes a big difference. And then there's the Johan Cruyff Arena. They're installing biodigesters to process food waste and create renewable energy.
So they're turning waste into energy.
Exactly. It just shows how these pilot projects can really push the boundaries of what's possible.
It's amazing. And it really highlights how much influence sports organizations like UEFA actually have.
For sure. They have this huge platform to get fans involved, work with their suppliers, and really drive that sustainable change.
Okay, so we've seen what companies and organizations are doing. But where do we fit into all of this as individuals? It can feel kind of overwhelming to even know where to start.
I think the 4R framework is a really helpful way to think about it. It breaks down the circular economy into these steps that we can actually take: reduce, recycle, and recover.
Okay, so let's break that down. What does reduce look like in our daily lives?
Well, it could be buying fewer new clothes, opting for those more durable pieces, or choosing products with less packaging. It's about being more mindful of how much we're consuming.
Right. So just being more aware of what we're buying.
Exactly. And then reuse could be something as simple as refilling your water bottle, using reusable bags, or finding creative ways to give old items a new purpose. You know, extend the life of the things you already have.
Upcycling, exactly.
And then there's recycle, which we've already talked about, making sure our clothes and textiles are actually recycled properly.
Yeah.
And then finally, recover.
Okay, what does that one involve?
Recover is about supporting those companies that are using recycled materials and advocating for policies that promote circular systems. It's about pushing for change on a bigger level.
So it's about taking action at all levels.
Yeah.
From our own personal choices to influencing the systems around us.
Yeah, it's actually pretty empowering when you realize that we're not just stuck on the sidelines in this whole circular economy thing.
Right.
Like, we can actually make a difference through our everyday choices and actions.
I completely agree. The more we understand how all these systems connect, the better choices we can make.
So let's take a minute and recap what we've learned today. First off, we saw how that old take, make, waste model is just not going to cut it anymore.
Definitely not.
It's time to move past that linear way of thinking and embrace the circular economy.
For sure.
And when we look specifically at textiles, it's clear that waste is a massive problem.
It really is.
I mean, we're talking mountains of clothes going to landfills and incinerators, and then we have that whole hidden issue of microplastic pollution.
Right. It's kind of a double whammy. It is. But it's not all doom and gloom, right? We also saw how organizations like UEFA are really stepping up and becoming leaders in this whole transition to a circular economy.
Yeah, they're not just talking about it. They're actually doing something, which is great.
What I thought was really cool was how they're approaching the issue from so many different angles.
Oh, yeah.
Like they're looking at apparel design, fan engagement, waste management at stadiums.
It's that holistic approach, recognizing how complex the problem is.
And for us as the everyday fans and consumers, the 4R framework gives us a really practical way to get involved.
It does.
It's about reducing our consumption, reusing what we can, recycling properly, and supporting those businesses that are doing things the right way.
Right. It's realizing that our choices matter.
Exactly. That even small actions can add up to big change. So as we wrap up this deep dive on the circular economy, we want to leave you with something to think about. Take a look in your own wardrobe. What's one item you could give a second life to? Maybe it's something you can repair or donate or even get creative and repurpose it into something completely new. It might seem like a small step, but remember, even small actions contribute to a bigger change. Thanks for joining us today and keep the conversation going.